In this video, we will be discussing Buddhism. Those were some images of Borobudur, which is the largest Buddhist temple in the world. It's located in the modern-day country of Indonesia. Before we get started, let's look at a couple quotes from the Buddha. First, one is not an outcast by birth. One is not a Brahmin by birth. By actions, one becomes an outcast. By actions, one becomes a Brahmin. Based on this quote, what is Buddha's opinion about the caste system? Clearly, he's expressing some disagreement with the caste system. He's suggesting that, in contrast to the caste system where one's place in lot in life is locked in at birth, that in actuality it's one's actions that determines their ultimate fate. Here's another quote. Do not accept what you hear by report. Do not accept tradition. Do not accept a statement because it is found in our books, nor because it is a saying of a Brahmin. Be lamps unto yourself. Those who shall rely upon themselves only, and not look to anyone besides themselves, shall reach the topmost height. So Buddhism evolved out of the Hindu tradition. And you can see here, they're adopting a lot of the aspects of Hinduism. So for example, this notion of reaching the topmost height, which in Hinduism we described as moksha. And in Buddhism, anyone can reach the topmost height, right? Buddha's encouraging people to be lamps unto themselves. As a result of messages like this, Buddhism is a more universal religion in that it allows for anyone, regardless of their position in the social hierarchy, to achieve the goal, which in the case of Hinduism was known as moksha. So the big questions we need to be able to answer after watching this video are: first, what are the origins of Buddhism and how did it spread? And second, what are the beliefs, traditions, and customs of Buddhism? So what are the origins of Buddhism and how did it spread? So Buddhism is based upon the teachings of Siddhartha Gautama, aka the Buddha, aka the Enlightened One. So Siddhartha Gautama was a prince who lived in northern India or maybe Nepal in sometime around the 5th or 6th centuries BCE. So he was a contemporary of Confucius. Now, a lot of students are confused about the Buddha here in the West, and so I show you two images, and I always ask my students, which one of these represents Siddhartha Gautama? So that's Siddhartha Gautama on the left. On the right, you have Budai, who is a Chinese Buddha, but he's not the Buddha. He's a Buddha. He's what's known as a Bodhisattva, but not the Buddha, Siddhartha Gautama. So Siddhartha Gautama lived around 500 BCE in India. His goal was ultimately to reform Hinduism and not necessarily start a whole new religion. And so we're going to see some similarities between Buddha and Jesus in that both of them were really reformers who were working within existing religious traditions. In the case of Siddhartha Gautama, it's Hinduism. In the case of Jesus, it's Judaism. So another similarity to Jesus has to do with Siddhartha Gautama's birth. The story of his birth has to do with his mother Maya, who was a queen, and one night she was visited by a white elephant carrying a lotus flower, and the elephant cut open her side while she was sleeping and impregnated her in a very similar kind of immaculate conception to Jesus. So Siddhartha was born a prince in a miraculous birth. At a young age, his father, the king, brought Siddhartha to a fortune teller, and the fortune teller said that Siddhartha would either become a great king like his father or a great holy person. And Siddhartha's father, wanting Siddhartha to become a king, fashioned a life for Siddhartha to ensure that that would happen. And so Siddhartha had a very privileged and sheltered life growing up. Any desire that Siddhartha had was provided to him. So he lived a very privileged and sheltered life. And then when he turned about 27 or 28 years old, he decided he wanted to venture outside the gates of the city for the first time. So his father had kept him so sheltered that he wasn't allowed outside the gates of their village. So Siddhartha saw for the first time suffering, and he saw old age for the first time. And then another day he saw sickness, and then on the third day he saw death. And so for the first time, he starts to experience this other aspect of life that is suffering. So he decides to leave the palace and he becomes an ascetic. Now, an ascetic is someone who gives up every pleasure in his life. So there are lots of images from Siddhartha's life during this period where he's shown very thin. The stories are he ate something ridiculous like 1 grain of rice per day in order to survive. And so he gives up all pleasures in his life. Now, eventually, he comes to this realization that it's neither satisfying your desires all the time, nor giving up all of your desires and living in complete suffering as a way to achieve deeper understanding of the world. Instead, the path to what he described as enlightenment was in the middle way, living a life more of moderation. Siddhartha meditated under a tree, and he reached a new level of consciousness known as nirvana. So nirvana is a state where all of your desires are released, and all of that suffering then is also released as a result of you not having any desires. And it's the final goal of Buddhism. And so if we were to compare it to something in Hinduism, we'd relate it to moksha, right? So it's this idea that there's this endless cycle of reincarnation, and that ultimately your goal is to get release from that cycle of reincarnation. And in the case of Buddhism, that release is known as nirvana. So Siddhartha became in this moment the Buddha meaning the enlightened one. And then he went on to spread his message and teach. So he began teaching his followers about how to achieve enlightenment, very similar to Jesus. He during his lifetime, he gained a number of disciples or followers. The Buddha did not ultimately claimed to be divine. In fact, when he was asked about God, he basically said, look, it's just too complicated. That's ultimately not what the focus is. The focus should be on the here and now and how you live this life. So he died, but ultimately his religion was carried on through his followers. Unlike Jesus, he died at a very old age, so he was in his 70s when he ultimately died. So he had much more time to spread his teaching during his lifetime. So as you watch this video, focus on where Buddhism starts. Buddhism will be in the orange, and then where ultimately does it spread. You can see the red there represents Hinduism. So you can see, starting in northern India, we can see the quick spread of Buddhism across India as a result of the conversion of the Emperor Ashoka, which we discussed earlier. Jesus is crucified in the Holy Land. The spread of Christianity across parts of the Roman Empire. Notice we see Buddhism now spreading into East Asia, China, Korea, Japan, and now spreading down into Southeast Asia. So it started in northern India, near Tibet, in the Indian subcontinent, and then ultimately it spreads to East Asia via the Silk Road, right, this trade network, and then also to Korea, the Korean Peninsula, and to Japan, and then down into portions of Southeast Asia. So one reason that it ultimately took hold very quickly was as a result of the conversion of Ashoka. If you recall, during the Mauryan Empire, Ashoka converted to Buddhism, and he put up all of those rock pillar edicts which professed his conversion to Buddhism. Ultimately, though, it didn't take root in India, but instead it spread via the efforts of missionaries and merchants along trade routes such as the Silk Road. So here you can see a Buddhist shrine that's located in China. And so there are a number of these temples which are dotted along the Silk Road along the way between the Indian subcontinent and East Asia. Why did people so readily convert to Buddhism? Well, Buddha's message was especially appealing to the lower classes, to women, the poor, right? That idea that anyone could achieve nirvana. You didn't have to be a male Brahmin in order to achieve the ultimate goal of the religion, the release from the endless cycle of of reincarnation. Now, another reason Buddhism was so popular among women was that it gave women the opportunity to become nuns and to live in monasteries. So you can see here an image showing these various Buddhist nuns. Buddhism, like Christianity, is one of those religions, especially early on in Christianity, where women were given some opportunities that maybe they wouldn't have otherwise been afforded in their normal everyday life. Whenever we're dealing with images of historical founders who have this essentially divine status, it's always interesting to see how they're represented. So here we can see early Buddhist iconography, images of a footprint, right? Because how do you capture in art someone who is essentially divine? You also may notice these swastikas here, which was a Hindu symbol, which also made its way into Buddhism, that eventually Adolf Hitler and the Nazis made very uncool. Over time, the Buddha took on a physical form, and that physical form varied greatly depending on where the statue was created. So as Buddhism spread, it started to blend in with local customs and traditions. And so the Buddha would sort of take on the appearance of the people of that particular region. So here you can see various Buddha statues, and we have to match them up. So this one here is what's known as Greco-Buddhism. You can see the sort of wavier hair and the facial features that are more European looking. This one here is a Chinese Buddha. This one, India. This one here is Japan. And then finally Southeast Asia. So as Buddhism spread into these various regions, it started to take on the local customs and traditions. So this is known as syncretism. The key thing with the syncretism is it blended then with those existing localized customs and traditions. And ultimately, you end up with statues of the Buddha that look very different depending on what region you're in. So that concept is known as syncretism. So as Buddhism spread, it divided very quickly. It split into two sects. There's the Theravada Buddhism and the Mahayana Buddhism. So Theravada Buddhism is predominantly found in Southeast Asia, in Burma, and Thailand. The Mahayana version of Buddhism is primarily practiced in East Asia, Korea, Japan, and China. So Theravada emphasizes more simplicity and meditation. It's more consistent with Buddha's probably original teachings about the nature of his own status and also how to achieve enlightenment through meditation and simple living. The Mahayana Buddhism, by contrast, focuses more on rituals and the divine nature of Buddha, and it focuses more on the salvation and the afterlife. And so Buddha is not necessarily considered just a teacher, but also a divine being. All right, so we will pick this up in the next video, but after watching this video, you should be able to answer this big question, which is what are the origins of Buddhism and how did it spread? Thanks for watching.